Welcome to Rethink You, bringing you ideas, inspiration, and motivation to start living the life you were created to live. Here is your host, author, trainer, speaker, and coach, and founder of Rethink You, Kim Levings.
Well, hello, and welcome back to the Rethink You podcast. I am enjoying the fact that this month of July 2021, our theme is leadership, and I have another great leader to bring to you today. But before I do, I did want to remind you to subscribe, review, and comment on this podcast. As you know, unsponsored media like this relies on subscriptions to keep us going. So whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to this on your favorite podcast stream, be sure to subscribe. And if you can, review us. That helps us become known to more listeners. So I would really appreciate that. I'm also talking about the fact that at kimlevings.com, I now have my leadership consulting journey available, and it's called Reset, a leadership journey to a healthy culture. I love to work with leadership teams in any size organization to help them through individual coaching, team collaboration, and forward motion to reset a culture and re-energize leadership. So check it out at kimlevings.com. Now, let me tell you about today's leader. Dr. Larry McEvoy, an emergency physician, healthcare CEO, and entrepreneur. Larry's interests are at the intersection of business, biology, and health. And those interests have forged his thinking about the need to innovate leadership exponentially for the challenges of the 21st century. His work focuses on regenerating organizations, companies, and communities to exponential health and vigor, where performance, learning, and vitality rise in parallel and are abundant, infectious, sustained, and sustaining. Wow, that is one heck of a mission, and I know that this is going to be a great discussion. Larry's book, Epidemic Leadership, How to Lead Infectiously in the Era of Big Problems, releases on August 31st, 2021. And trust me, I will be one of the early readers. I can't wait to get my hands on it. You know, from 2008 to 2012, Larry served as the CEO of the Memorial Health System here in Colorado Springs, and he facilitated a strategic and operational turnaround, the emergence of a culture of collaboration and commitment, and Memorial's transformation from an at-risk and unfunded municipal hospital to the threshold of its merger with the University of Colorado Health System. Larry graduated from Stanford University Medical School in 1992 and completed his emergency medical residency at Hennepin County Medical Center. As a lifelong horseman, outdoorsman, and biologist at heart, Larry can be found, or rather be difficult to find, as he stewards the return of the Cove Canyon grasslands in south central Montana to its once and future abundance. So without further delay, let's jump into my conversation with Dr. Larry McEvoy. Well, Larry, welcome to the Rethink You podcast. I'm so excited to be interviewing you today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Kim. Thanks for having me.
So Larry, tell us, as an emergency physician for much of your professional life, I've heard you say that you were focused on difficult circumstances and destruction, and you then became interested in how things become healthy again. So as we get started, tell us about the genesis of your thinking behind epidemics.
Oh yeah, that's worth talking about a little bit. By the way, I wasn't focused on death and destruction since early childhood, but when you're an emergency physician, we train to take care of the things that people hope don't happen to them when they start their day. No one gets up to get diagnosed with breast cancer, have their aorta tear in half, bleed into their brain, or get in a bad car wreck. But that's what we see every day. We sort of wait at the funnel of probability, if you will, for the chance that turns, or the risk that turns into something real, and there we are. And I enjoyed the work. They often say that emergency physicians are adrenaline junkies. I never really thought of it that way. I enjoyed 2 or 3 things about the work once I was, finished and done and complete. which of course is the beginning, not the end. And what I really enjoyed was the chance to make decisions that counted with the information that counted when you had to make them. I enjoyed the fluidity and the adaptivity that we needed to create in a team, not just once, but repeatedly. And I really enjoyed helping people. There really is no, it's a cliche, and we eye roll at it and sounds Pollyanna and, not real world in this hard, cynical age we live in. But I don't think there's anything better than having someone come in the emergency department with their wrong day having surprisingly popped up in the middle of what they thought their day was going to be like, or their weekend or their night or their vacation or whatever it was, and say, you know what, we can help. Here's what we'll do. And you'll go on. You're going to go on to your graduation or get married or finish your vacation or raise your kids, whatever you want. It's enormously rewarding to kind of participate in that, be able to offer something, and to know that people will go on. But the longer I did it, the more I realized that very little of what we did was actually serendipitous, out of the blue, lightning striking. I was fine and now I'm not. Most illness, especially in, probably all over the world, most illness, most disease burden, the most cost, the most agony, the most disruption of life comes from things that are predictable. They've been happening a while. They happen a lot. And it's a little bit like playing roulette or gambling. Sooner or later, the odds catch up with you. And the other thing that I realized was it'd be nice if you could just say to people, hey, stop smoking, lose weight, eat a good diet, have good relationships, get plenty of sleep, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the prescription for health. But what I realized is we have the prescription for health. We do. But having the prescription for health is no better than a doctor saying, I have the prescription to fix your disease. If you don't take the medicine and you don't live in a healthy way, you're not going to be healthy. So I realized that I was at the back end of a funnel that was creating a lot of death and destruction. And my colleagues and my teammates' efforts were, if you will, well-informed, well-intended, well-fortified with technical training, and falling ridiculously behind if we're really after health in a comprehensive human individual sense and a comprehensive population societal sense. So that was when I started thinking that this tutorial, if you will, of living in destruction and duress and degraded circumstances and degraded, happenstance, whether it was a twisted ankle or back pain or, again, things that were more dramatic, was a great entree for me to start thinking about health. And it was a real puzzler. Okay, what do? I was raised professionally and developed professionally to be a leader. There's no megaphone, no org chart box, no personal skill set big enough to say, now that I see this, I can personally and individually make this happen everywhere. If you think that way, we should have another podcast about what the kind of, what people like that really think. If you're not like that and you're thinking, how do I, as a small person, having learned from death and destruction and all of this duress, how can I participate in creating a groundswell, a massive swarm of health in all sorts of nooks and crannies and places and topics and ways that I can't personally get to? What's the math for that? And so that was my journey into this idea of, if that's what you're after, who is the teacher and where are the teachers?
Right. Very fascinating, Larry. And, as you think about who are the teachers, it's almost the vision that comes to mind for me is almost like lighting all these little fires to create one big wildfire, rather than us each just making our own fire to keep ourselves warm. So, that took you down the path of creating the epidemic for good. And I know that, prior to us starting the recording, you were talking about your vision of starting the intentional epidemic and having different branches of that. So before we even talk about your book, talk to us more about that vision. What are you up to with that, and explain perhaps what you mean by epidemics for good?
Sure. Well, that again goes back to the story of Larry as a frustrated emergency physician. And this is actually the opening chapter in the book, recounts an experience I had where we were doing very well one Saturday or Friday or Saturday evening years ago. we were thinking and performing and treating and interacting with patients and families as well as we could. And we were getting buried, and we were only one emergency department. So I started thinking, who does this well? Well, sitting right in front of me and embodied as me was this idea called biology. Each of us is 300 trillion cells. That's a lot. That's a lot of cells bumping into each other, but it doesn't get bureaucratically bogged down. I mean, if, the place where you are were to catch on fire right now, you'd have no trouble ending the call, explaining to me what's going on, calling 911, getting out of the building. So our bodies as embodiment of biology are unbelievably stable. They're constantly adaptive. They're very resilient. They're massive at the scale level. 300 trillion cells is a much tougher problem than 7 billion people, if you think about it at the level of math. And so I thought, well, this is kind of goofy. We're sitting here trying to address these problems, perhaps by not listening to the wisdom of the operating system that they run on. And I started thinking about this idea of epidemics, which of course I've been taught to stop: domestic violence, opioids, STDs, HIV, measles, chickenpox, influenza. I mean, there's a million of them. And I thought, how is it that these witless things, they have no brains, these viruses and these bacteria, and yet they grow and swarm and travel, and you knock them down with a vaccine one year, they pop up in another place another time. So I thought, I'm going to start thinking about epidemics as a positive thing. And we can talk more about that in a second. But my intent right now is to help people think about creating intentional epidemics, things that are intentionally exponential, widely permeating, hard to knock down, very tenacious, but they're positive. The three that come to mind for me, because I'm interested in health, are, I think we need to have an epidemic of leaders who lead epidemically. We clearly need an epidemic of innovation if we want to continue to get healthier, which is my continual obsession as a person and as a physician, and I think as a parent and a grandparent as well, and as a citizen. And I also want to help people create an epidemic of place. Everywhere you go in the world, if you travel, whether it's down the street to someone's home for dinner or into another town or into another country, I think we recognize that when that goes well, a unique and healthy place is a crucible, it's a lattice, it's a network that holds health in place, and in all sorts of ways that you could measure, right? Per capita income and life expectancy and mental health indices and all that thing, number of kids who graduate from this or that. But it also holds at the individual level. You can go into homes where people are having conversations and they're laughing and they're thinking seriously, and they're learning the next thing they want to do with their lives. And this is something you can find all over the world. And all over the world, you can find shattered places. You can find places that have been, sort of dismissed and discounted and marginalized. And you can find innovation working toward health, or you can find innovation working merely toward greed and ego and the next cool gizmo. And I think you see the same thing in leadership, right? Right now we have some interesting strains running in our leadership population that I don't think really are taking us toward health. So for all those reasons, my idea of the epidemics that I'm kind of interested in as one small doctor wanting things to be healthier far beyond my imagination is, what if we created an epidemic of leadership that was epidemic itself? What if we created an epidemic of innovation toward health and vitality? And what if we created an epidemic of healthy places? What does that look like? So that's my, when you ask me my vision, I want to be really clear. There's no megaphone or trumpet, and I'm going to do this. It's something I would like to participate in, contribute to, benefit from, and a community I'd like to create with people who are similarly oriented. And I have to say, probably none of these themes are new. I'm certain they're not. But in the pandemic year, I've heard many, many people from all walks of life approach what I would call a critical mass of saying, what we're doing isn't working anymore. Let's stop arguing about that. What does generative, creative, collective, connected thinking look like now? Because that's what I want to do. How do I find it? And I'm hearing that from and between more and more people, and they're not sort of Pied Piper, wandering souls out in the desert. These are real people, right, with jobs and families and executive careers, or, early in their careers, starting their professions, just getting out of school, all ages, all walks of life, saying, you know what, I want to play by different game rules, and I want those game rules to be healthy, and I want that health to go in all directions. So I think that's a really, really positive vibe, let's call it. And then the question is, how do you go from a vibe to an approach?
Fascinating, Larry. And I know that some of these concepts are, if I can speak for the listeners, they're probably grappling, trying to put this into some kind of terms that they can understand. And I think that it starts with, sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, just a simple example is returning shopping carts in a parking lot. You have one person return the cart to where it belongs, and you'll find that most people who saw that will mimic that behavior. It can be as simple as that, where you're creating this universal connection where you have everybody pursuing the same epidemic. And I think the timing is good because, we're still dealing, in many countries are still dealing with COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic. And I think that there's lessons from there that it's a metaphor that people sadly would understand more now than previously. So maybe let's just take a little detour and say, what specific lessons did you see, perhaps whether in the medical community or just in general, that came out of how we handled the pandemic?
I've had the chance to, both informally through my own professional networks and, text strings and all that sort of stuff, as well as more formal, conferences and workshops and talks, ask people, hey, in the healthcare field, what was a pandemic like for you? What did you learn? What was so icky you just don't want to go through it one more day and never again? And what part was kind of revelatory, a refreshing insight? And did they pop up together, or was it all one or the other? And it's interesting, the list of exhaustion, feeling that our old rules don't work, that people weren't listening to people, and we had information, but we couldn't respond fast enough. All that stuff that you saw play out in everything from political arguments to public health disputes to mask disputes to vaccine delays in, PPE, all that stuff was real. And the other thing people would say when I get them talking with each other and then kind of sifting through that workshop style, there was so much stress and strain that in some ways we were left to our own, and we found out better ways to do things sooner, easier. What'd that feel like? Did it work? It actually worked really well. Did you learn some things? Oh yeah, we learned how to learn faster, and we felt almost freed up by that. Energizing, de-energizing, extremely energizing. In fact, we're now wondering how near post-pandemic, if that's really where we are, and I have my thoughts about the Delta virus and the number of unvaccinated, percentages out there. We'll see what happens. But what they say is now in this, quote, post-pandemic era, the conversation we're having is how can we be more fluid, more responsive, more horizontal than ever before? And that we're wondering in our organization, how do we do that? Will it happen automatically, or will we sort of snap back to this more rigid, prospective, controlled way of doing things, which we saw doesn't really work in a helter-skelter world where an anonymous virus can get on airplanes, get all over the world, get through our immune systems, and find all of us. So I think that's one of the things that I think is it's a hat hanger for me. More and more people realize you can design the way we lead and team and organize in a way that's more fluid, more adaptive, more emergent, more democratic, if you will, right? Wide participation designed the right way. And there are principles to this that are very concrete along the lines of social physics, and there's good science behind this stuff, can actually create better thinking, better action, and better interaction. And that to me is what an epidemic is. It's infectious patterns of thought, action, and interaction that drive better results, better learning, and better vitality. And there are a million ways to do that. So I think that we're we're at the doorway to a lot of really serious, big, gigantic problems. And I'm encouraged by the growth and the we're not going backwards kind of attitude of the new thinking that's emerging. I find it very, very encouraging.
Right. I'm reminded of perhaps the overused term of saying, the new normal. But it's just such an interesting insight, Larry, because I too have run across people. I've seen a dichotomy of thinking. Some have gone for that, what's possible, as you said, that sort of democratic right systems to do things better. Others are like, I wish things would go back to the way they always were.
Yeah.
And so having that split, I think, is indicative of how the human brain works. So I love that concept of thought, action, and interaction. Hi there, it's Kim. And I wanted to just stop by and say, I hope that you're enjoying this episode. If you are, please be sure to like, review, and subscribe, whether you're on a podcast feed or the YouTube channel. As you know, putting out media takes time and effort, and we live for subscribers and reviews. So if you think this is a great podcast, please tell the world about us and be sure to subscribe. Thank you. Now let's get back to today's interview. Perhaps let's sort of focus in and zero in now a little on epidemic leadership, and talk to us in terms of what you think leaders can do and how you focus on what is epidemic leadership?
Yep. So like a lot of us, probably like a lot of your listeners, I was leadership developed in conventional ways for years. Leadership camps, workshops, tools. I've been tooled up the wazoo. I don't have any negative things to say about that, except I was in a leadership development program for executives, a decade and a half ago, maybe. And we were going around talking about our challenges. And I said, they asked what my challenge was. And I said, I'd like to learn how to understand how to go from linear to logarithmic. And there was this kind of uncomfortable pause. And so when I talk about epidemics, I think that's the key, right? You can be and need to be, if you're in a leadership position, certainly good at your job as a leader. I'm not knocking that at all. But the real problem in the world these days is not what problem we have or that there are a lot of problems. It's that the challenges we have are big, they're diffuse, they come from anywhere at any time, they're unpredictable. It's the whole VUCA thing. And so if you're going to lead in a VUCA world, it seems to me you've got a couple of challenges. One is how to be continually adaptive, and two, how to create capacity that's far ahead of the challenges at hand. Because if the challenges are bigger than the capacity, it's just a matter of time before you lose. Any casino knows that. And I had not had a lot of development or training or learning for too long in my life about how do you actually create capacity. And again, there's the human body right in front of me. You're septic, you're in the ICU, and 3 weeks later, you're home walking around. If that's not restorative capacity, I don't know what is. So I think if you're thinking about leading epidemically and wondering what that means, and my nerdy underpinnings of this scientifically are network science, complexity science, and neurophysiology, but leaving that aside for a second and being practical, if leaders can do 3 or 4 things that emulate what epidemics do, but do it with a positive idea that could become a pattern of thought, action, and interaction and can be infectious, it really boils down to, can you create the conditions where this positive idea or ethic can flourish? Because right now where I live in Montana, we're having, like probably the rest of the US anyway, a big hot heat wave. Trying to garden out in that heat when we don't have enough water, it's a nice idea. But if you don't have soil conditions with the sufficient moisture, and you don't have conditions where those plants aren't just seared by this solar heat, and where I live, it's about 17, 18 hours a day, good luck. I don't care what kind of seed you have. I don't care what kind of green thumb you have. It's not going. So I think the idea of not just having a task list and an agenda and accountability loops and scorecards, but what conditions really foment abundant shifts in how people think, act, and interact is requisite. It's like your petri dish. If you want to grow a pathogen in the petri dish, and someone, you get a culture from someone's nose or a urine culture, or you draw blood from them. You can't just dump that stuff on the floor and hope it goes. You have to actually put it in a petri dish that's designed so things will grow there so you can see them. So item 1 is conditions. Item 2 is that if you look at COVID, the disease, and coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen, that thing can't really infect you unless it interacts a certain way with you. It's got these little antigens on it, and or receptors rather, antigens rather, and you have these receptors, and those things have to dock. Say, well, that's nice. Who cares? If you have a bunch of people bumping into each other in your system, and you do, only a small fraction of those bumpings is with you personally. In fact, the bigger organization you're part of, the more collisions there are in that petri dish, in those conditions, and the less control you have over any given condition. In other words, if you're the brain, which has 100 billion neurons, there's not one neuron that's involved in all of those collisions, and there's not one neuron that determines this is how we will collide. So as a leader, you have to think, if step 1 is how I create conditions, step 2 is how do I/we create the kind of interaction design that every time any combination of people bump into each other in any kind of work, out the back end, performance goes up, learning goes up, and vitality goes up. Because if you can create conditions like that, you're going to have some gong show days. Two people are going to get together and just make a mess. One meeting is going to go wrong, an initiative is going to go sideways, but the pattern will be every time we connect, we perform a little better, we learn a little faster, we're a little bit healthier and more energetic. And if you structure the way people interact, and there are sound neurophysiological principles around this, then you can let the math play. Do you need to pay attention to it as a leader? Yes. I like to say you need to model it, right? So part of modeling is embodying, not being perfect, but embodying those principles. Another definition of the word model is to design it so that it happens everywhere in the system, not because you say, but because people participate, elect, commit, and decide, you know what, this works. I'm going to put that shopping cart away. I'm going to spend my time listening to someone before I speak, whatever the design rules are. And then, of course, the third thing is you've got to have multipliers in the system. If 2 people interact really, really well, and those two people are a tiny percentage of the interactions in the system, the pattern of the system is not going to change. And you're trying to change the pattern. And that brings us to probably the ultimate multiplier, networks. Networks, social networks, are where we hold or change our patterns.
Wow, I can't write fast enough, Larry. I'm just excited that I can go back and actually watch and listen to this interview again, because if anyone is like me, if they're driving and listening to this podcast, they're going to go home and re-listen to it with a notepad in place, because that's just been powerful. Those 3, creating the conditions, having that intentional interaction, and having multipliers. The vision that comes to mind is almost, if you imagine a color over all these heads, the cartoon type style, yes. You can either have this huge wave of a positive, or you could have a huge wave of negative. And you're so right, because we bump into each other just like we do at a cellular and neurological level. So just such great stuff. Thank you. And I know too that some people may be listening to this and saying, well, I'm not really a leader, I'm just whatever. But I think that you're getting to something deeper. So it's leadership of ourselves, but also leadership in the world. And I know that earlier you used the powerful reference that you are focused on regenerative abundance. I love that term, because it's about how we think and act and interact. Talk to us about maybe some simple steps that people could take just in their everyday. We've mentioned 1 or 2 about the shopping carts and others, but what would you say is a starting point? If someone said, I want to be an epidemic leader, what is that? And someone says to them, what does that mean? What are you going to do?
Yeah, well, I would say from a conditional sense, think of yourself less as a teller and a director and more as a convener. If you can assemble people, when those people assemble, there's the powerful possibility of amazing good things and wreckage. Too many of us fear that, right? We live in democratic societies, or we say we do and we want to, and whatever the combination is, wherever you are, it's a little bit of a scary thing to let people say, we decide. So I would say if you want to think epidemically in a concrete way, begin convening people and asking them, if we were to go after this, that, and the other, based on something that was really healthy from us, for us, by us, with us, and our stakeholders, what's on your mind? So start convening rather than directing. And there are ways within that convening you do it. There's some great research out there. Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck is just the crystallization of what we know is a lot of really healthy neurophysiology that allows people to think, act, and interact far more generatively. In other words, we didn't get to the moon via NASA in the 60s by saying, we'll never make it. We tried once, it didn't work. You can't do it. You know, all these things that we do and all things in biology are iterative. They are littered with messes. And so having a growth mindset in that convening is a big deal. I think another one is Barry Johnson's polarities, this idea of both and. And sometimes those of us that are more likely to think either or black and white think, well, that's some kind of intellectual or secular, relativism. There really is truth in the universe. That's not what both and thinking is about. Both and thinking is about when you convene, you're going to have diverse perspectives. In those diverse perspectives, there will be both alignment and unity, and there will be diversity of perspective and differences. Those are both essentially necessary to each other. It's not that one is better or worse. Too much alignment and you have lack of possibility. You can't change, et cetera, et cetera. Too much diversity and you have chaos. So I think for leaders to start saying, how can I really get quite skilled at convening people into a growth mindset and into polarity-based both and thinking are really, really requisite. I think the other thing is when you just go to this idea of interaction design, there's just some great research out there on conversational intelligence, neuroplasticity, simple techniques that allow us to become not flimsy or unreliable, but very flexible in our thinking. Some days we have to be rigid in our thinking. That's what the situation calls for. And people can say that. I've seen them do it in the organizations that I led. They get together and say, today, what do we need? Well, today is a 1, 2, 3, get it done day. And maybe tomorrow is, let's not get something done. Let's step back and say, what do we need to think of first? So those are a couple of things I'd start with. And I think maybe the last thought I'd have, I feel like a doctor giving advice, quit smoking, lose weight. I think that the field of relational design, social physics, and network design is unbelievably powerful stuff. Some of your listeners may be thinking about behavioral control when I say that. That's not what I mean. If you design really healthy networks, you're designing ways and places for people to participate wholeheartedly, to haggle, with integrity and mix differences, and then through that to have both wider participation and differences of perspective and deeper collective intelligence. We do this with our computing platforms. We have cloud computing, and the world of biology is full of collective intelligence. I think it's time that we embrace collective intelligence as the leadership currency of the 21st century and help people understand it is not at all the opposite of free individual participation in thinking. In fact, it requires it if you look at how to design collective intelligence. I hope that was concrete enough. I go hours.
Absolutely. Oh, I know. But as I said, I can't write fast enough because you just said the most amazing things. And I just love that. We need a deeper and deeper collective intelligence to become the leadership currency of the 21st century. I love that because I've had my own experience of, how you get stuck in an echo chamber, right, and you only hear the same stuff. And then you go outside and say, gee, there's this whole world out here. And suddenly you widen your perspective. And I think that you've given me personally a lot to think about. And I'm sure the listeners feel the same way. But I know too, Larry, you've alluded to a few times, and I know we only have about 10 minutes left here. Can you think of at least one or maybe two life lessons that you learned early that helped you later on, sort of concretize some of these learnings, solidify?
Yeah, I think one was certainly that night in the emergency department where I realized my individual effort, which had been something I was developed to invest in, to trust, that was my resource, was become good as an individual, not don't be a team player, was simply not enough. And right next to that, trying to go heroic or superhuman is not the answer. So I think a life lesson for me was, in all this bigness, being small well counts. It's how we aggregate small, not how we try to go from being small to big ourselves. And I have an inherent distrust, and probably many of us have for a long time, at individuals who try to be bigger than they are. I don't mean try hard or, give everything they have or be wholeheartedly committed, but folks who don't seem to understand that humility really is a virtue. It's not the opposite of confidence. And when you don't have that, when you try to be the thing, the reason, the show, the source, that abrupts collective intelligence more than anything else. So that's a life lesson. I guess another one would be listening to, so I'm thinking of the work that I do now, which is as diverse as a school in Uganda, helping organizations reach high performance at a systemic level, and the land I live on. And all three of those settings have had really tough times, really, are kind of degraded ecosystems at some point. And so I think another life lesson for me, from watching patients miraculously get better, even though we did the same thing with them that we did to the person before who died, to watching land rebound and schools rebound, is that resilience, wholeheartedly designed, is an unbelievable phenomenon to trust, right? And when I say resilience, I don't mean that code word for you're in a screwed up system, so try to be personally resilient. I'm not talking about that whole difficulty. I'm saying when you look at how living systems can rebound, recover, and roar into vitality, to me, that's just really a life lesson that's sometimes hard to comprehend. But for me, it's a North Star about any of the work that we do. We should immerse ourselves in those experiences so that that energy buoys us, but also so that our mind is constantly reminded what may look so dark and so hopelessly snarled up is actually quite capable of rebounding quicker and sooner than we think, probably, into abundance. And so those are a couple of the things that I try to remember at this point in my life.
Powerful stuff, Larry. I feel like there's a whole lot more there, but I know we need to come to a close. I may have to schedule you again in a few months after the book is out, and we can have another conversation. What final thing would you like to say? We've got 2 minutes left here before we close. Final parting thoughts. I know you've dropped so many on us, but so to ask for more feels greedy, but I'm sure you have one or two more things you'd like to say.
I think sometimes when we talk about business or education or government or community or performance or athletics, sport, whatever, we like our models, right? Do we follow this model or that model? What change management model do you use? I think those are interesting conversations. I'm a mental model conceptual geek to some degree. I think one thing I'd leave with the listeners is that underneath all the models on this planet, there is, underneath all the programs, if you will, if you want to use sort of computer and computing language, underneath all those programs, there is an operating system. And that operating system is biology. It is not an operating system. It's not just a topic in school like home ec or mathematics or English literature. It is the operating system of all life on this planet, including not just human life, but human endeavor, governance, organization, the corporate world, commerce, business, economies, neighborhoods, biology, our biology, and our relationship with biology that sustains us and requires us is the operating system on this planet. So I guess the invitation I'd toss to your listeners is, if you know biology, keep learning it and thinking about how does it translate as an operating system. If you do not know biology and you're struggling with these big things, it's time to immerse yourselves a bit in biology and ask, how is it able to deliver on this grocery list of sustainability, agility, adaptation, innovation, mutation, resilience that we so seek in all other areas of our lives? And so I put a plug in to start understanding and translating and leading with biology as an operating system.
Wonderful, Larry. Well, thank you so much for that. I know that I've mentioned it a few times already. I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, and thanks again
Likewise.
for being here. Hopefully this is part one. We'll have to do part two in a few months because I feel like I need to give you a longer slot.
Well, somewhere my sons are saying, no, don't give them any more time, but thank you so much. It was wonderful to chat with you. I hope valuable for those folks listening as well, live or later, and best to you in all that you do.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks so much.